Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a historical figure whose life, well, it completely blurs the line between hard reality and mythic legend. We're talking about a guy who had fabulous stories written about him while he was still breathing, and who eventually became the hero of a full-scale legend. This is the incredible story of Alexander the Great.
12? That's a number I really want you to burn into your memory today. Because in just 12 short years, Alexander completely toppled the massive Persian Empire, marched his armies all the way to India, and essentially laid the foundations for a totally new world order. I mean, 12 years to completely reshape the known world. But the real question we're tackling today, the absolute core of this character study, is this. Why did people actually think Alexander was a god? We're going to trace that massive psychological shift, watching him go from a young Macedonian king to a guy who actively demanded to be recognized as a living deity.
Section 1. The Boy King Ascends. Consolidating Power.
Right, so picture this. It's 336 BCE. Alexander's father, King Philip II, is assassinated, and 20-year-old Alexander ruthlessly seizes the throne. And he did not mess around when it came to securing his home base. When a rumor of his death sparked a rebellion in the Greek city of Thebes, Alexander marched 240 miles in just 14 days. He didn't just defeat Thebes, he literally razed the city to the ground. 6,000 people were killed, survivors were sold into slavery. He spared nothing but the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. Unsurprisingly, the rest of Greece was immediately cowed into submission.
To conquer the world, you need the ultimate machine, right? And Alexander inherited a perfectly tuned strike force of about 35,000 men. The core was 14,000 Macedonians. You've got the backbone, the heavily armed infantry phalanx holding massive 13-foot spears, backed up by light-armed archers. But the true game changer, that was his elite companion cavalry. It was an incredibly balanced, highly lethal engine of war.
Section 2. Toppling the Persian Empire. The Great War.
So with Greece locked down and his army primed, Alexander looks east. Let's trace this timeline because, honestly, the pacing of his victories is just dizzying. May 334 BCE, he smashes the Persian army at the Granicus River. Boom! By autumn 333, he routs the Persian king Darius at Issus. He then pivots south to isolate the Persian fleet, which leads to a brutal 7-month siege of Tyre in 332, before finally arriving in Egypt that November. In roughly 2 years, he claimed the entire eastern Mediterranean coast.
Now, during that grueling siege of Tyre, a desperate King Darius sent Alexander an unbelievable offer. He offered a massive ransom of 10,000 talents for his captured family, and get this, the cession of all lands west of the Euphrates River. Alexander's veteran second-in-command, Parmenio, hears this and gives some very grounded pragmatic advice. He says, "I would accept, were I Alexander." And here is Alexander's legendary absolute mic drop response, "I too, were I Parmenio." It is just a stunning display of boundless ambition. He wasn't interested in compromise. He didn't want half an empire. He wanted unconditional surrender.
And that ambition, it soon evolved into something much, much deeper. When Alexander reached Egypt, he made this grueling desert trek to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa. And there, the priest greeted him with the traditional salutation of a pharaoh, calling him the son of the god Ammon. This was a pivotal psychological turning point. The seeds of his absolute divine complex were planted right there in the Egyptian sands.
So returning from Egypt, we hit the climax of the war in October 331 BCE at the Battle of Gaugamela. Alexander decisively shatters the Persian forces. King Darius flees, Babylon falls. Alexander marches straight to Persepolis and ceremonially burns down the magnificent palace of Xerxes. His so-called Pan-Hellenic War of Revenge was officially over. But for Alexander, the war was really just beginning.
Section 3. The Edge of the World. Into the East.
With the Persian Empire toppled, the Greek allies were basically told to pack up and go home. From here on out, this becomes a purely personal, grueling campaign. The logistics of pushing into these unknown eastern territories were an absolute nightmare. First, they have to hunt down a usurper named Bessus in Bactria. To do that, they push the army to absolute extremes, crossing the Hindu Kush Mountains through a pass at 11,650 feet, dealing with severe food shortages. They eventually push all the way into India, where Alexander fights his last great battle against King Porus and his war elephants at the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE.
But you know, there's a limit to human endurance. And at the Hyphasis River, the great war machine finally broke down. The troops were utterly exhausted in body and spirit, getting soaked by endless tropical monsoon rain. They openly mutinied. They completely refused to take another step east. Alexander was furious, absolutely adamant they keep going, but ultimately, he had no choice. He agreed to turn back.
And the march home was perhaps the darkest chapter of the entire saga. Alexander led a portion of his forces through the Gedrosian desert, and it was a total disaster. Waterless terrain, zero food, sudden monsoon floods, it caused massive suffering and a catastrophic loss of life, especially among the women, children, and camp followers. It deeply darkened Alexander's mood and really changed his style of leadership moving forward.
Section 4. Fusing a Fractured Empire. The Great Experiment.
Now, back in Susa and Babylon, Alexander is ruling this vast, incredibly diverse territory. His solution was this radical, highly controversial administrative experiment that caused a massive cultural collision. See, Macedonian tradition dictated that a king treated his senior officers and soldiers as relative equals. But Alexander started adopting Persian court ceremonial, specifically proskynesis. This meant prostrating yourself, actually bowing face down before the king. To the Greeks, this was an act of worship reserved strictly for the gods. To demand it of humans, completely intolerable. It deeply alienated his veteran troops.
But he doubled down on this fusion policy anyway. At Susa, he and 80 of his highest officers took Persian wives in a massive mass wedding. He handed out dowries to 10,000 soldiers so they could marry native brides. He even brought 30,000 Asian youths into the military, trained them in Macedonian warfare, and added Persian nobles to his royal cavalry. His Macedonians didn't see this as a beautiful picture of unity. They saw it as a direct threat to their privileged status, which led to yet another open mutiny at Opis.
Section 5. The Fall of a God, Paranoia, and Death.
Alexander's growing megalomania sent his whole story into a tragic final descent. It became defined by intense isolation and deep paranoia, taking a lethal toll on his inner circle. He executed Philotas, the commander of his elite cavalry, for alleged treason. Then he secretly ordered the assassination of Philotas' father, his old general Parmenio, literally just to eliminate the threat of revenge. He personally murdered his trusted commander Clitus in a drunken rage. And the historian Callisthenes, he died after refusing to perform that prostration ritual we just talked about. His closest inner circle had degraded into this lethal web of suspicion.
By 324 BCE, Alexander was formally demanding that Greek cities accord him divine honors. But, well, a god's reign on earth is brief. Following a prolonged banquet and heavy drinking bout in Babylon, Alexander suddenly fell ill. 10 days later, on June 13, 323 BCE, the man who conquered the known world died. He was only 32 years old.
He had reigned for exactly 12 years and 8 months, but he left behind one fatal flaw. He never appointed an heir. And the bitter irony of his life's work is that almost immediately after his last breath, his vast empire was torn apart. His generals began bargaining, fighting, and carving up the provinces amongst themselves. The whole empire just shattered into independent kingdoms.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to take away from today's explainer. Look, Alexander's military genius is unquestioned. He truly conquered the world. But as we saw with his descent into paranoia, his alienated army, and his shattered legacy, winning a war and forging a lasting peace are two entirely different things. He conquered the world, but could he rule it? I'll let you be the judge of that. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll catch you in the next one.